And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Father William Watson, S.J., author of 40 Weeks, Letters from Prison, published by Sacred Story Press. Always good to see you, Father
Nice
Watson.
to be here again. Thank you.
People remember seeing you back during the summer when you were on with your confrere there, Father Mitch.
That's right.
On the live show.
That's right.
It's good to have you here. So this book, 40 Weeks, An Ignatius Path to Christ with Sacred Story Prayer, and then it's Letters from Prison. Do you have multiple books involved in it? Is this all one book?
That is all one book. When I started my institute, Doug, I built my main adult Ignatian program called 40 Weeks, An Ignatian Path to Christ. But I always had plans to do multiple versions of it for specific target audiences that need special help.
And this is targeted at prison ministry and prisoners?
To prisoners. Okay. And it wasn't something that I initially thought of. It was one of those random graced moments. I got a letter, it'll be 3 years ago, last August, to whom it may concern at our institute. I'm a federal inmate. I'm in year 19 of a 25-year sentence for federal armed bank robbery. A Catholic deacon gave me a copy of your book. He doesn't have time to give me spiritual advice. Is there anybody there that can give me spiritual advice?
Right.
And I thought, I don't have time to be a prison pen pal.
Right.
So I contacted the deacon. He gave me the deacon's address, and I said, "Is this guy, scamming me or something?" He said, "No, he's the real deal. I've known him for 20 years. He is a very sincere Christian." And Deacon Pat Logston said to me, he says, "Father Bill, I think Jesus is knocking on your door and inviting you to help people like Richie."
Right. And
so I made a deal with him. I said,
Okay.
I wrote him a letter. I said, "If you start the program over and once a month send me 4 short letters of your questions for each week, I will give you spiritual advice if you give me permission to put our correspondence in a special edition of 40 Weeks for people who are in prison." He was very excited about it.
Right. So now, Deacon Pat ran Anthony House for 30 years, a transitional home on my home out on Long Island, Rockville, Diocese of Rockville Center. But there's a tragic story in here in the dedication about him. Yeah,
there's 2 tragic stories. The only 2 people that Richie knew well in his life. One he met at an AA meeting about 20 years ago. He heard this priest give his testimony, asked him to be his sponsor. The priest ended up being Father Michael Judge, the Franciscan who was the chaplain of the fire department.
At the Twin Towers.
Who was killed in Twin Towers. And then Deacon Pat, who had known Richie for 30 plus years, was last November 3rd in 2017, he was stabbed to death by a new resident at his transitional house.
Right.
So I had to walk Richie through that process. But the only 2 people whom he told me knew him are dead. So I'm kind of playing the surrogate father.
So did those experiences reconfirm your interest in doing something towards prisoners, or did it make you step back a little bit?
Well, people told me, they said, there's 2 strikes. They said, you're now the 3rd person who's in the lead seat here. Are you afraid?
Yeah. I mean, did it give you pause at all?
I think what motivated me was the depth, the sincerity, the vulnerability, and the commitment of this man whose life was a mess for most of his life, and he's found Christ, and it's given him hope. And I waited monthly for his letters to come, to see what he was experiencing, so I could write him information back.
So did you grow spiritually from reading his letters yourself personally?
I think I did, very much so. I think it made me more compassionate. It kind of tenderized my heart to people who are in great need.
Right.
And he was so honest in what he was saying. I mean, many of the letters brought tears to my eyes in terms of what he had been through, given up for adoption, an adoptive family that was less than loving, getting in trouble early, feeling like his life had no value. So it was very, very moving for me, very moving.
Right. Well, how do you react to people that say, well, it's great, once you're in jail, you suddenly get religion?
Well, that didn't happen to him. I mean, it was a long process. I think he was a person who had a good heart. I think he got in trouble early because he didn't have very good foundations. And many of the people, Father Mitch and I were talking last summer about this, many of the people in prison, mostly men, are people who came from broken families who had no fathers.
Right.
So these 2 priests, one a deacon and one a priest, were his surrogate father figures.
Right, which is why you would think the society would spend more time trying to keep families together rather than pull them apart.
Exactly, right.
Now what, Father Greg Boyle, S.J., who's fairly well known with dealing with gangs out on the West Coast and things like that, he has a foreword to the book there, and he tells a story, and the idea of applesauce. What does applesauce mean?
It's if your readers or your watchers read the foreword,
Right.
it's about two gang members who grew up in a family where there was almost nothing to eat, and they're always opening cans, and there's always kind of
Right.
junk in the cans that they don't like.
And the silver cans, because the
And the
labels
silver
are
cans,
off.
they get
So
it-
it's kind of like waiting and hoping it's going to be something special.
Getting at a food bank, and then one day they get applesauce, and for them it's like sirloin and all these incredible foods, and they're overcome with joy. Such a small gift brought huge gratitude. And it does bring tears to your eyes in terms
Right.
of how people have almost nothing, and
Right.
people in prison have very little.
Right,
So,
exactly. Exactly. Now, it's interesting, too, because he also points out that undeniably this book will reveal that God is always, who is always greater, as St. Ignatius says, who loves you without measure and without regret. That's the tough part. People say, well, I mean, what about the victims that these people
Right.
had? Everybody's got a sad story, but,
Sure.
there's still bad things happen. How does one go about forgiving like that?
Well, there are the people who are the victims of a crime who have to learn how to forgive.
Right.
And I've oftentimes seen situations where a convicted felon is executed, and the victims are in the room, and they're happy that this man is being killed. And I always think, are you going to be living with that anger for the rest of your life? And there is that capacity to forgive. But you've seen other stories where something has happened. An individual or a family has been victim of a crime, and immediately to say, I forgive the person. And that's what Jesus did on the cross.
Right, and I remember, I think, Mother talking one time about something and talking about in different times on her shows the idea of forgiving somebody and deciding you like them are not necessarily the same
They're
thing.
not the same thing.
Right.
You can forgive from the heart, and it can exact a great spiritual price from you,
Right.
but you have offered that forgiveness. But we basically are saying, I am not going to hold anger against you.
Right, yeah, because ultimately it works against the
It works
person
against
holding the anger, right?
It works against you. Anger held in, grudges held in, collapse the immune system of the body, and God made us in a certain way to forgive and to be grateful.
Yeah, buried feelings are buried alive. They always show back up again
That's
later.
right.
So
That's right.
you talk about, this book is intended for those who find yourself in jail or prison, like Richie, want a spiritual resource that offers practical steps to build a relationship with Christ and a life of prayer and discernment. It's also for your friends and family and the many chaplains who serve you in prisons and jails everywhere. Let me ask you, you put this book together, and so this particular edition is focused on, is this a pretty small market you're going for here?
The market that our spiritual programs are focused towards is a smaller niche, even in a parish. Because what I'm asking people to do, I'm asking, and I think maybe in terms of like a parish community, the seriousness of the program and the number of people who are going to want to do it may be a slice like 2% of a parish population. But we're using a methodology that Ignatius used for the first Jesuits. He says, go to the people who know they need help, and they will be the ones who will respond to the help you have.
Like our Lord said, in a
Like
sense
our
of
Lord.
coming for
So
those
he worked
who
with
were
12
sick,
people
right.
who changed the world. I want to work with 30 people in a prison or 40 in a parish who are motivated and whose lives are transformed, and they will then become the leaven for the larger community. So
Right.
my programs are targeted to a specific audience who's ready to take a deep dive in their faith.
And it's interesting because a connection in a way because of Ignatius, he kind of had a rogue lifestyle before he became,
right.
Very much like, in a sense, like Augustine, the same thing. So we have these great saints and great spiritual leaders who they didn't grow up as Pollyanna.
That's right. They say every saint has a past, every sinner a future. And when Richie read the brief account of Ignatius's life in 40 weeks, he wept because he realized that if Ignatius had such a bad first 30 years, it gave him hope that holiness was possible for him even in prison.
Right. You say we must take heart that God's love always finds us and always sends angels our way to help us. Some are spiritual beings like the saints and angels. That is why I chose the book cover that represents St. Ignatius Loyola in heaven answering the prayers of prisoners. And I'm sure we can show that book cover. I'm sure it's up there. And so you picked that out. Now you also published this thing, so how did you work that out?
I always pray for, what I was initially looking for a cover that would kind of be mass market appeal, but I thought, no, this is for prisoners. I need a cover and an image that's going to give hope to them. So I was over in Rome for one of my other jobs, and I was at the Church of the Gesù, and there's this hallway that has painted little vignettes of the stories that were a part of the canonization process for St. Ignatius. And one of them is this image where he is floating in a prison, and there are prisoners who are chained to the wall. And one of the cases for Ignatius's canonization were prisoners who had said Ignatius had visited them in prison and answered their prayers. So I thought that would tie beautifully in with the Ignatian book and the market that were the people that were promoting.
And of course, our Lord talked about that in the Sermon
on
the Mount, of course. In the beginning of this, when you get into the whole 40 weeks itself, which is there are very few who realize that what God would make of them if they abandon themselves entirely to his hands and let themselves be formed by his grace. And that's St. Ignatius Loyola. And I always remember Mother Angelica, one of her quotes was, her great fear was that when she got to heaven, you know, she would disappoint the Lord, and that he would say, if you only trusted more, how much more we could have done together, in a sense.
I could have been a contender.
Kind of right, exactly, right. You're on the waterfront now, okay. Now you're in my space. Now, in the introduction, you're saying, following Ignatius' wisdom, all you need to engage the spiritual journey is a generous heart and a willingness to be transformed by Christ's purifying forgiveness and mercy. Then you say, it is the narrow path to holiness. Is holiness a narrow path these days? Some ways it seems like it's very broad. You're saying it's narrow.
The path to life, as Jesus says, is narrow and few choose it. And what I'm saying, I'm following Ignatius's own story and the improbability of his conversion being successful. He was only granted grace that kept him moving forward, because his life was transformed. He's on his bed in Loyola. He has his conversion experience. He pilgrimages to Montserrat, where he's going to visit the shrine of the Black Madonna. He gives up his sword. He makes a confession of his whole life, which is part of this process. The first 14 weeks leads
In fact, I know you talked about that with Father Mitch on the show.
Yeah, to a whole confession. And Eddie didn't have a priest to make his whole life confession, so he skipped breakfast on a cold, rainy morning and went out in the prison yard and read his letter to Jesus and wept. So very powerful. So what Ignatius did was try to save himself through this very, very damaging process of reconfessing his sins.
Right.
So he got into this very neurotic, very spiritually damaging. He knew it was damaging him. He said, this is damaging me, but I can't stop it. He wouldn't listen to the advice of the best spiritual guides. And he got to a point where he said, so disgusted with himself that he was basically getting ready to walk away from the whole project. And then he gets an inspiration. Where did that thought come from?
Right.
And that gave him the tipping point, that graced insight, which is it is the tipping point of his whole conversion. It's where that's the point where he would not surrender. He would not admit to God, I need to be saved by you because I can't do it.
Right.
And that is the scary part for any Christian. And the Christian life begins when the person realizes, I can't do it. And I'm going to need Jesus Christ every day of my life till I meet him face to face.
Kind of version of the old let go, let God.
Let go and let God. But it's as Dorothy Day said in her autobiography, it's a harsh and dreadful love.
Right, exactly.
It's a scary path.
It's very scary.
To surrender. And I tell people, like on a retreat, I tell Jesus, you can have this, but you ain't touching that.
That's right.
So it's the that he wants, because it's the that really is holding you back from freedom.
From being with, right. And you talk about in here, and it's 40 weeks, and 40 weeks is biblical, but then you say, what do you mean by weeks? You talk about going through it as an individual or as a group, but then you talk about a week being measured not by hours and days. Well, how is it measured then?
Well, this is the inspiration for me saying that comes from the spiritual exercises, which are 4 weeks long. The last time I made a 30-day retreat, I stayed in week 1, which is the purgative, for the whole 30 days.
Okay.
I wasn't expecting that, but that's how the grace worked. And at the end of the 30 days, I moved gradually into the rest of the program. It's where the Lord keeps you. And Ignatius says, do not move forward if you are drawing fruit from a certain meditation. So I have it structured as 40 weeks. Most of the people can do the exercises and move forward, but there may be some who get stalled, who get grace for a certain time, and they want to stay there until the Lord kind of moves their heart forward. So it's the flexibility. Here's the structure. The Lord may move you in a different way, but basically keep this structure for the most part.
Right. I thought it was interesting too, realizing that that these exercises are incremental, so they build on each other.
Right.
Do them slowly, because I think sometimes in the way we like to do things today is, let me get through it.
Right.
Let me get through this thing, and I'll get it by, and then I can check the box and say I did that.
Right.
And at the same time, you also say, don't read ahead.
Right.
Right.
Don't anticipate what you're going to be doing. See, that's not the Holy Spirit that's working. And there is the person who wants to read ahead, kind of check things off like they've mastered it. You're not mastering it. You're simply learning a spiritual discipline that's going to give you the tools to daily examine your conscience and open your heart to Christ for daily healing, weekly healing, monthly healing, till the day that you meet Him face to face in the
You also
kingdom.
talk about, if you hit a wall, if you reach a point in the 40-week prayer process where you think you can't continue, here's my advice: jump to the last chapter, abide in me. Why?
It is my explanation of my own spiritual journey and what I had to do. And I think people get stuck because they either get frustrated with the sin they find in their life, they think they can't do it, and so it's a hopeful and a cautionary tale that completing the 40 weeks is not going to make you a master. It's simply the beginning of a process of the rest of your life.
Right, and it's also not something a person necessarily does once, right?
That's right, but I would prefer if they do it a second time, they act as a guide and a leader for other people instead of
just by themselves.
Instead of trying to
Well,
get it
I was
done
going to ask you,
perfectly.
how does one know when one's ready to move ahead, and how does one know when one has hit a wall?
I think I give people the tools to that in terms of understanding, what it is. The caution is, like Ignatius, you can try to become a perfectionist, and you get stuck by trying to perfectly master the discipline. There are many people who have tried to complete a doctoral dissertation who've never done it. We call them ABD, all but dissertation, because they're trying to create the perfect dissertation, and there's always more information, and they just get stuck and they never complete it.
Right.
So I'm trying to cut off that kind of neurotic anxiety process and say, just keep moving forward.
Keep moving forward.
When we were filming our DVD series for this, there's a gentleman in the crowd. He said, when I said yes to this filming project, he says, I thought it was 4 weeks, not 40.
Right.
And I said, Mark, the reason I said 40 is because I didn't want to scare you and say it's for the rest of your life.
There you go. Okay, even more so. In the beginning, and then getting into, because obviously it's a long book, it's got a lot of material in it, but in the very beginning, part 1, listening to your story, entering your sacred story, you point out, if you're looking for quick fixes to spiritual or psychological problems, you will soon lose heart. Is that something you see that's a problem for most of us? We're looking for the 10 things I need to do to be happy or be spiritually successful.
Right. Who stole my cheese? Right. It's kind of like,
and who moved it too?
Yeah, who moved it too? Right. Right. Very good. Right.
Yeah.
So I think people are looking. They're looking for the hot new program that's going to give them the spiritually perfect ab
so this
or
is
face.
Sniff and Scurry's version of spiritual exercises.
I'm making it very clear that this is not an easy climb. It's doable. But it's open, again, Ignatius's wisdom, go to the people who know they need help. When Richie wrote to me, he was a guy who needed help, and he was ready for it.
You say, if you seek only external confirmation of religious or political biases, you'll be frustrated. What does that mean?
It means that people who are waiting for others on the outside to affirm what their own interior convictions are not claiming their own authority, but they're going to be manipulated by basically the crowd movement.
Okay.
And you can't be looking outside to gain approval in terms of what you're doing. It has to be an internal reality that's validated by the Holy Spirit and Christ in your life.
Okay. This one I thought was interesting. If you live principally by rules and laws, or if you avoid all rules and laws, you'll be surprised. Those who live by laws alone will encounter the fierce love that exceeds all laws, and those who reject laws will discover that love has unambiguous boundaries of right and wrong. So again, there's that middle ground That
Right.
it's not total rigidity and it's not this free-form thing.
Right. And I think in a lot of the exhortations and off-the-hand comments that Pope Francis is making, he's been making that point. John Paul made it in his own way. Benedict made it in his own way. And St. Paul discovered this too. You're not saved by the law. So you can try to live perfectly all the regulations. And your perfect adherence to regulations you can associate with sanctity. But it's not. It's a form of Pelagianism, basically.
Right.
And then there are people like the rich young man who says to his father, you know, I reject your tradition, I reject your name, everything. I'm going to do what I want on my own. So those are the people who want to live without any rules or regulations, and they soon run into trouble too.
Right.
So both of those polarities lead nowhere, and it is basically letting your life be transformed by Christ. Pope Francis, I think, in probably the first month or two of his papacy, he said, truth is a person. And it's the direct encounter of a person's heart, especially where they're wounded and sinful, and encountering the mercy of Jesus Christ is what ultimately transforms us. And I said to Father Mitch last summer in the show that if you allow that process to happen, if you really want to be holy, you have to be willing to not feel holy. Because the closer your heart gets to God, the more you're going to see what a mess your life is.
Well, you think of Aquinas with the straw and that whole idea.
That's right. So and everything becomes God's grace. You become very humble, and you become much more compassionate to people who are in need.
If you're actually progressing.
If you are actually progressing.
You say unless you engage 40 weeks in complete freedom of heart, you'll fail in the practice and undermine its purpose. So this is something a person has to want to do, not because everybody said, oh, you got to do this.
Right, and then I didn't want parishes to say, in order to get your certificate or to go through the RCIA program, you've got to do this, because there has to be a willingness to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to be, it's like forcing a forced marriage. It doesn't work.
Right. You also say, Jesus calmed the storm that terrified his disciples in Mark. Engage sacred story prayer if you're distressed about the chaos in your life and believe God is calling you to a secure shore. Do you think chaos is a big part of what people feel like today? They just feel
I think if they're
overwhelmed?
honest and if they slow down and they gain any measure of silence in their life, a lot of people, they're in great chaos. Desperation, unhappiness, unfulfilled. And that's why I'm promoting this 15-minute discipline. It's doable, it's strategic, it's very effective, but it gives that little island of silence in the day where you can pull apart and start listening.
That examine prayer.
That examine prayer.
Okay.
Examination of conscience.
I thought this was interesting too. You said Jesus demanded to know the names of the demons. Engage these exercises if you are weary of your spiritual, psychological, and material demons. Welcome these exercises if you're willing to name them with Jesus by your side. And again, to some degree, it's what you were talking about before. Now, well, we can talk about these things, but leave these things alone.
Right. And it's the addict, whoever she or he is. You know, maybe it's your double fudge ice cream pint every night, or could be cigarettes, it could be alcohol, could be pornography, could be wealth and money, anything that is a demon that is engaged with a spirit that lacks freedom, interior freedom, that creates ultimate anxiety in your life, and you have to say, this is a problem for me. And many people are not willing to say that.
I'm going to jump way ahead. I thought what's a passive narcissist?
Well, Doug, I did this because in a lot of feminist readings of Ignatian spirituality, they say that the issues of Ignatius's narcissism, which were very aggressive, are not what women experience. And women's challenge is not that they make themselves the center, but that they fail to center themselves and so are always giving to other people. And I thought, well, that's not necessarily true. And then I started doing some research, and I realized that there's two ways that people can make themselves the center of their own universe. One is aggressively going out there as the victor, or someone can passively feel the victim, and everybody else is victimizing them. So they're doing exactly the same thing as the aggressive narcissist.
The active narcissist.
Yeah, the active narcissist. But they're turning everybody towards themselves, and they're controlling the situation as effectively, maybe more effectively, than the aggressor.
How long did it take you to write this book?
The 40 weeks, I would say, in terms of its ideas, was about a 30-year process.
Okay.
Including a doctoral dissertation to focus on the methodologies of
Well, it's not going to
hypnosis.
take another 30 years to show up with another book, is it, Father?
No,
Okay,
I've
good.
got one coming out, and actually it's already out and came out in September.
Okay, good. Well, we've only been doing a show for 20 years. We'll see if we're still around when you show up with another book. Father William Watson, always a pleasure. SJ, the book of 40 Weeks, Letters from Prison, An Ignatian Path to Christ with Sacred Story Prayer. Very interesting work available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks.